WNBA finals. And so I'll leave it there. I mean, I'm just obviously disheartened. You know, I'm a human too. I have a family. I have 2 kids who are devastated by these comments. And so all I'll say is just, you know, it's...
The WNBA just secured a mind-blowing $2.2 billion media rights deal, shattering every established record in the history of women's sports. Yet the rookie phenom, directly responsible for this historic financial explosion, is making a base salary of just $76,000. For months, the mainstream sports media has been relentlessly pushing a picture-perfect narrative about the meteoric rise of women's basketball, and giving all the credit to brilliant front-office executives while praising the ownership groups for finally guiding the sport to the promised land. But behind closed corporate doors, a massive and highly calculated deception has been slowly unraveling, and the person standing right at the center of the crosshairs is none other than WNBA Commissioner Cathy Engelbert. When Caitlin Clark stepped onto the professional hardwood, she didn't just bring a few extra casual fans to the arenas. No, she fundamentally altered the entire financial ecosystem of the game on a global scale. Millions of brand-new viewers tuned in, merchandise sold out in literally minutes across the country, and franchise valuations skyrocketed overnight from mere millions to massive 9-figure price tags. Yet, while the billionaire owners and the executive league office were quietly swimming in unprecedented cash, the players were being fed the exact same tired excuses they had been forced to swallow for over 2 decades. They were aggressively told the league was still heavily struggling, that ultimate profitability was just out of reach, and that they needed to remain quiet and patient for the good of the game. The truth, however, is finally leaking out to the public. And the shocking details surrounding the current collective bargaining agreement reveal a carefully orchestrated scheme designed to keep the athletes completely in the dark while the executives cashed out at the highest possible peak. What is currently happening behind the scenes of the WNBA isn't just a simple standard contract dispute between labor and management. It is an absolute brutal war for the future of the sport. And the commissioner's carefully crafted public image as a champion for women is beginning to violently crumble. But the financial manipulation actually started long before anyone even knew what the Clark effect actually was. And to understand the deception, you have to look at who is actually running the math. To fully grasp the sheer magnitude of the deception currently unfolding in the front office, you have to understand the specific corporate background of the woman pulling the strings. So before Cathy Engelbert took over as the commissioner of the WNBA, she was the highly successful chief executive officer of Deloitte, one of the absolute largest and most ruthless accounting and financial consulting firms on the entire planet. She possesses a mind that is entirely wired for complex corporate structuring, navigating massive tax loopholes, and protecting billionaire assets at all costs. When she stepped into the commissioner role, she brought that exact same Wall Street mentality to a sports league that had spent 27 years aggressively claiming it was losing tens of millions of dollars every single season. For decades, the WNBA relied on a massive financial subsidy from the NBA just to keep the lights on, and the owners constantly used that supposed unprofitability as a weapon to suppress player salaries and deny basic workplace benefits. But over the last few years, and the math simply stopped making sense to anyone paying attention, the league began quietly expanding, bringing in massive ownership groups in completely new markets. The Golden State Valkyries, a brand-new expansion franchise, reportedly paid a staggering $50 million expansion fee just for the right to enter the league. Shortly after, expansion groups in Toronto and Portland threw down identical massive mountains of cash to secure their own teams. If the league was truly bleeding money and entirely unprofitable, brilliant billionaire investors would not be lining up and fighting tooth and nail to hand over $50 million entry fees. The franchise valuations were secretly exploding behind the scenes, yet the players who were literally putting their bodies on the line every single night were still being told there wasn't enough money in the budget to guarantee them basic living wages. And Engelbert was utilizing her world-class accounting expertise to simultaneously sell a narrative of explosive growth to elite billionaire investors, while legally pleading absolute poverty to the athletes who actually made the product valuable. When Caitlin Clark finally declared for the professional draft, the entire financial ecosystem of women's basketball was violently turned upside down. But the league's manipulative tactics only escalated to a terrifying new level. The incoming rookie class didn't just bring hype, they brought a verifiable economic tsunami that fundamentally broke every existing metric the WNBA had ever recorded. Television viewership for the draft alone spiked to nearly 2.5 million viewers, completely eclipsing countless mainstream men's sporting events. When the season officially tipped off, the Indiana Fever began averaging well over 1 million viewers every single time they stepped on the court. They're frequently beating out massive regular season NBA matchups. The demand to see Clark play in person was so incredibly overwhelming that rival teams across the country were forced to entirely abandon their traditional smaller arenas and move their home games into massive NBA-sized stadiums just to accommodate the tens of thousands of screaming fans. Cities hosting WNBA games were suddenly reporting massive a multi-million-dollar local economic booms simply because the Fever were in town for a single night. Despite this completely unprecedented avalanche of newly generated revenue, the players' salaries remained violently stagnant, chained to a deeply outdated collective bargaining agreement signed back in the year 2020. The league was happily utilizing Clark's name, image, and absolute superstar gravity to sell out entire stadiums and drastically inflate their own corporate value. Yet they legally refused to adjust the financial compensation for the very women generating the wealth. The owners were pocketing literally millions of dollars in unexpected ticket sales and luxury suite upgrades every single night, while the athletes on the court were still operating under a severely restricted hard salary cap that prevented them from seeing a single extra dime of the massive profits they were actively creating. It was a masterclass in corporate exploitation, but the players were finally starting to catch on to the illusion. The mechanics of how the league office managed to keep the players locked out of this unprecedented financial windfall is hidden deep within the notoriously complex wording of the 2020 Collective Bargaining Agreement. When that specific contract was originally signed, Cathy Engelbert went on a massive celebratory press tour, proudly announcing to the entire sports world that WNBA players would finally have the opportunity to secure a 50-50 revenue split with the league, completely mirroring the exact same economic structure used by the men in the NBA. It sounded like a monumental historic victory for women's sports, but there was a deeply hidden, mathematically brutal catch that completely rigged the game against the athletes from the very beginning. And that highly publicized 50-50 revenue split would only legally trigger if the entire league managed to hit a highly specific, cumulative revenue growth target of 20% over the previous year. On paper, to the average fan, it seemed completely achievable, especially with the explosive growth of the game. But critics and financial experts are now pointing out that the league's internal accounting practices seem almost entirely designed to ensure that 20% threshold is mathematically impossible to reach. By utilizing highly complex corporate strategies like aggressively inflating marketing expenses, restructuring executive bonuses, and categorizing massive investments as operational losses, the league can officially claim that their net revenue hasn't grown enough to trigger the clause. And this is a classic tactic known as Hollywood accounting, where a massive blockbuster movie can make $1 billion at the box office, but legally claim it lost money on paper, so the studio doesn't have to pay royalties to the actors. Even with Caitlin Clark bringing in completely sold-out crowds, shattering television rating records, and generating tens of millions in brand-new corporate sponsorships, the league office quietly maintained that they simply hadn't hit the magic number yet. But the athletes were legally locked out from taking their fair share, and the anger in the locker rooms began to boil over into absolute fury. The true depth of the commissioner's financial camouflage was dragged into the blinding spotlight when the shocking details of the league's brand-new television rights package finally leaked to the public, exposing a level of corporate greed that left the players completely speechless. For the WNBA quietly partnered with the NBA to negotiate a monumental 11-year media rights package worth an absolutely staggering $2.2 billion. This new historic deal averages out to about $200 million a year, which is more than triple what the league was previously making from its older, outdated television contracts with traditional networks. Naturally, you would think that the commissioner would be eager to immediately sit down with the players' union and figure out how to fairly distribute this new, life-changing mountain of cash. Instead, the league tried to keep the specific financial details of the valuation entirely under wraps for as long as possible. The executives were actively sitting in elite corporate boardrooms, weaponizing the insane viewership numbers from the Indiana Fever games to leverage billions out of megacorporations like Disney, Amazon, and NBC, all while looking their players in the eye and telling them that paying a higher living wage would bankrupt the entire operation. The WNBA Players Association, led by incredibly sharp minds who were starting to aggressively crunch the numbers themselves, realized they were being completely played. They saw the astronomical television money, and they saw the sold-out stadiums, and they saw the explosive merchandise sales, yet the league was trying to lock them into an 11-year television deal without offering a single massive structural change to their salaries. The length of the deal was entirely intentional, designed to secure billions for the owners right now while ensuring the players wouldn't have the leverage to negotiate a massive cut for over a decade. The illusion of a struggling, cash-strapped league was shattered forever. And the athletes realized that the commissioner's office wasn't trying to protect the integrity of the WNBA, they were actively trying to ruthlessly exploit the players' sudden burst of global fame. But the financial manipulation extending from the league office wasn't just limited to television contracts and complex revenue-sharing algorithms. It directly impacted the physical safety and health of the players on a daily basis. The dark reality of the league's massive financial cover-up became glaringly obvious during the massive charter flight controversy that completely took over the internet and sports media earlier this year. For literally decades, WNBA players had been desperately begging the league to pay for private charter flights, citing severe safety concerns, extreme physical exhaustion, and the absolute nightmare of dealing with aggressive fans at public airport baggage claims. The danger was incredibly real, highlighted violently in 2023 when superstar Brittany Griner was terrifyingly swarmed and heavily harassed by political agitators while trying to walk through a commercial terminal. Despite that terrifying incident, the commissioner's office gave the exact same cold response, claiming a league-wide charter program would cost upwards of $25 million a season and that the WNBA simply did not have the capital to make it happen. And they even went as far as strictly enforcing a rule that heavily punished and fined any rogue team owner who tried to pay for private flights out of their own billionaire pockets, claiming it would create an unfair competitive advantage. But when Caitlin Clark entered the league and immediately became the target of extreme media harassment and terrifying mob scenes at public airports, the optics became an absolute nightmare for the corporate sponsors. Suddenly, the entire narrative of the struggling, cash-strapped league completely evaporated into thin air. Within an unbelievably short amount of time, Commissioner Engelbert magically found the massive funding required to launch a full charter flight program with Delta Airlines for the entire league. The veteran players were absolutely furious, not because they finally had the private flights they deserved, but because the sudden reversal proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the money had literally been sitting in the bank the entire time. The league didn't magically generate $25 million out of thin air in a matter of days. They simply realized that the massive PR disaster of their biggest golden goose getting mobbed at an airport was going to heavily damage their billion-dollar television negotiations. The safety of the veterans who had built the league meant absolutely nothing. But the exact moment the corporate sponsorships were threatened, the vault was suddenly opened, permanently destroying whatever remaining trust the players had left in the commissioner. The absolute boiling point for the locker rooms across the country wasn't just about the massive influx of money or the blatant hypocrisy regarding private airplanes. It was heavily tied to the commissioner's handling of the incredibly toxic culture war that suddenly engulfed the league. As the season aggressively progressed, the intense mainstream spotlight brought a wave of extreme toxicity, and the commissioner's handling of the highly volatile situation proved exactly where her true loyalties actually lied. The intense physical rivalries on the court, specifically the highly publicized and heavily debated battles between Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, began to draw out a very dark, heavily polarized, and sometimes downright racist element from certain new corners of the rapidly expanding fan base. Players across the league were being heavily harassed online, receiving terrifying personal threats, and dealing with a level of extreme vitriol that the WNBA had never seen in its entire existence. The tension was palpable, and the players desperately needed the league office to step in, take a massive stand, and protect the mental health of its athletes. When Kathy Engelbert was invited onto a massive nationally televised CNBC broadcast, she was directly and pointedly asked about the dark and toxic nature of this new polarized fan base and how the league planned to protect its players from the severe targeted harassment. Instead of taking a strong moral stand, fiercely condemning the hate, and protecting her athletes from the abuse, Engelbert completely deflected the question. She smiled for the cameras and casually compared the highly toxic, racially charged situation to the legendary, heavily marketed rivalry between Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. She openly stated that the friction and the massive debates were incredibly good for business, actively highlighting the massive corporate sponsorships and skyrocketing television ratings that were rolling in because of the drama. The public backlash was immediate and absolutely explosive. The Players' Union publicly slammed the commissioner in a highly aggressive official statement, directly accusing her of turning a completely blind eye to the very real psychological and emotional damage her players were actively suffering simply because the online drama was driving up corporate engagement metrics. Engelbert was essentially entirely exposed for viewing her players not as human beings who desperately needed protection in a highly volatile, highly dangerous environment, but as literal gladiators in a corporate arena meant to generate maximum profit at